Hello and welcome back to another Rush Duel Links video. Today we're going to be making a new tier list for the Go Rush and Fusion era of Rush Duel Links. The two new boxes and the two new structure decks have been out for about a week, so we have all these new characters, we have all these new cards, we have all these new decks, and after about a week we're going to kind of get our first impressions of the meta. Now again, the first week is usually quite volatile. People are experimenting with new things. Some people are losing more games they otherwise would when they have more refined builds. Some decks are winning more games than they should because people don't know how to play against them just yet. So take this with a pinch of salt, but this is just a first impressions of how the meta has shaped up after the first week. So first things first, let's go and take a look at the data. So the deck with the most wins is Cybur Dragons with 5 tournament wins, followed by Mataran with 3. And we're looking at 1 win each for Spellcaster Fusion, Dragon Fusion, Light Galaxy, and Psychic. So of these decks, Cybur Dragon has gotten a bunch of new stuff, so it's basically a new deck. All of the rest of them are brand new decks except for Psychic, which has made a little bit of a resurgence. What we tend to do is look at our top 4 points, because points have weighting based on what position the deck finished in, which can be more accurate than just checking a deck's representation during a tournament. So Cybur Dragon has a total points of 40 during the top 4, which is staggering. That is almost twice the next highest, which is Mataran. Then we have Spellcasters, which again is almost half of Mataran's. Dragon at exactly the same, Light Galaxy just behind, and then there's a little bit of a drop off for Psychic, Elemental Hero, Machine, Vulcan, Cybur, and then Overlord has not made any top 4 spots but did make a top 8. So this is basically the meta so far. These are the primary decks that we're going to be taking a look at. And if we scroll down a little bit, we can see our pie chart, which gives us a bit of a better visual representation. Cybur Dragon being this lovely giant blue slice of this pie, which is very staggering compared to noticeably a much smaller slice in Mataran, and then noticeably smaller as we keep going round. So it does look like the fusion decks are performing very, very well. Cybur Dragon, Mataran, Spellcaster Fusion, Dragon Fusion. Light Galaxy isn't a fusion deck, and neither is Psychic, but then we get back to Elemental Hero. It seems like Elemental Hero is the worst performing fusion deck at the moment. So let's start with our first deck, and our first one is going to be Dragon Fusion, and I think this is quite an easy tier 2. Dragon Fusion basically has just the one gimmick. You are able to attack twice. Now the boss monster is basically just Dragius on steroids. It has more attack points. It can boost its attack by 900 up to 39, which is a little bit frustrating because it means we can't attack over 4,000, and there are 4,000 monsters that do exist, such as Cyber End and such as Big Drago. But being able to attack twice with 39 is still pretty good, and its other effect is it can attack twice and have piercing, which is really, really good. Piercing is so strong in this game, as we've already seen time and time again. The biggest culprit of this typically is Mirror Innovator, which has just shown that card can play on a different axis to other decks, because a lot of other decks, for example, can't play a defensive style game because the only way they can get damage in is by clearing your opponent's entire board and getting some sort of direct attack. Dragius can do that on its own. It was the original clear the opponent's board and get a direct attack deck, but it does now have the added benefit that you do have one monster that can double attack Pierce and kill your opponent with only having one face-up monster to play around some other decks, notably Royal Rebels and Mataran. The downsides of this deck is that the skill is a little bit restrictive. Unfortunately, we're not able to just use this skill willy-nilly. Your opponent already has to have their board set up in order to get the added benefits. That is one kind of minor drawback. The other is that we don't really have a good way to get our boss monsters out any easier. Most people are running the Sports Dragon package, which is fine, but if we don't find that package early, and we do find a bunch of the deck's boss monsters, you can't really get them out of the hand too easily, so it does tend to brick a little bit, but still, very strong deck. Next up, we have Machines, and Machines is, I'm not entirely sure. It's going to be either low tier 2 or high tier 3. I think we'll put it high tier 3 for now, and we might change this a little bit going forward. So Machines is a decent deck. It has been a strong deck since it came out back in Steel Kaleido Mirror. It's basically Mirror Innovator, the deck, and then stuff that goes around Mirror Innovator. Mirror Innovator is just such a powerful card, being able to boost its attack to ridiculous numbers, being able to have piercing, as well as the fact there are just some generic support cards for it, such as Vicon, which can help you get this card out easier. Typically, we are seeing this played alongside the Ultimate Bond skill, which also allows you to run more high-level monsters with lesser chance to brick, since we can get rid of one of those high-level monsters and grab a normal summonable Aim Eagle, as well as having the added benefit that it can sometimes give a monster a 1000 attack point boost. This deck has seen a little bit of life breathed into it with the new format. It does have a few new cards in the Imaginary Reactor, which is a monster that was supposed to be used in the Mataran deck, but because Reactor's effect is generic, all we have to do is take a monster reincarnation from our graveyard, put it on the bottom of our deck, and we get to draw 2 cards. The weakness of the machine deck has always been, it hasn't had that many good ways to plus. The best the machine deck's ever had is Bicorn, which can get you a discount on something out of boss monster, so we effectively save a card. But now they have Imaginary Reactor, they can effectively sometimes, not all the time, but they can sometimes get that +2 draw, which is really, really powerful. People really do underestimate the ability to plus in Rush, and it is actually incredible. This deck oftentimes would end on quite weak boards, and still does, but occasionally you do get that +2, you can get an extra body out, you can get an extra back row on the field, so it does actually help the deck out immensely. And next up, we have Cybur. I think Cybur is going to be a low tier 3 for me. Cybur is still around, it's still a strong deck. The maximum Ragnarok skill is still very, very good. Being able to reduce monsters' attack and discount your boss monsters is never really going to be bad. Eventually it will get like hard power crap, but it won't be for a very long time. And there are still more future Cybur cards that we could release early to make this deck feel more powerful if Konami really want to. But just being able to surprise drop the maximum is still really, really strong. Chaos Femtron is still a really, really good card. What really lets this deck down now is that more and more decks have the ability to deal with an Yggdrago, and this deck used to kind of bully your opponent, right? You used to be able to summon out a lot of guys very, very quickly and kind of overwhelm your opponent. Decks are now getting faster and stronger, so they're able to deal with the pressure that Cybur can apply a lot more easier, and Cybur as a whole still do have very low defense values, which some decks can take advantage of. For example, the Dragon Fusion deck does now have a double attack piercer, so if the Cybur player is forced on the defensive, well, you're about to take a lot of damage to the face. So still a strong deck, still very tournament viable. We're still seeing it top a little bit. I mean, if we go and take a look at the data, we can see that the deck has got one top 4 position in this week alone, and that's just on the first week where everything is a bit up in the air. So we could see this make a bit of a comeback in the coming weeks. Next up, we have Cybur Dragon, and I mean, this again, take a look at the data. Cybur Dragon is by far the most powerful deck right now. It has the highest representation, it has the most tournament wins, it has the most top 4 slots, it has the most top 8 slots. It is everywhere. This deck is just so strong. You're able to quite easily amass a board of several 2000 plus attack monsters. You have a very strong out to a lot of high attack threats in the Assault Dragon. We have easy access to Fusion and Proto Cybur Dragon using our skill, which means getting out a Cybur Twin is pretty effortless. Cybur Twin in itself is just amazing. 2800 attack that can attack twice is really, really powerful. A 2500 attack twice in Dragius was really, really strong for such a long time. It's no doubt that just a better Dragius is really, really powerful. Cybur Dragon also has the benefit that it is very free to play friendly, and is very simple to play. The deck does technically have combos. There are different lines you can make, but they're relatively straightforward. Cybur Dragon's never been an overly complex deck, but maybe compared to some of the other decks, it is a little bit more complex, but I would still say it's quite an easy deck to play, which does make it very attractive to newcomers, and we do have a lot of them with the introduction of Go Rush. But Cybur Dragon, absolutely ridiculous kind of powerhouse bully deck, and a very aggressive option that people seem to be gravitating towards. Next up, we have Spellcaster Fusion, and Spellcaster Fusion, much like Dragon Fusion, is performing quite well. And they do actually have a very, very similar win rate. If we take a look, Spellcaster Fusion and Dragon Fusion, we are seeing the same number of tournament wins, the same number of top 4 positions. Spellcaster is seeing more top 8 finishes, but they have identical points in top 4. So these decks are basically neck and neck. Now, which of these decks is stronger is a bit up for debate. These decks do play a little bit differently. Their skills are similar, and their game plan is kind of similar, but the way they go about it isn't exactly the same. Dragius basically has one main objective: summon out your big dragon, attack multiple times, kill opponent quickly. Spellcasters are a little bit more nuanced. They do have a little bit more going on, but their options to actually close out games are a bit more limited because they do lack that easy access to piercing that the Dragius Star has. 7th Paladin can boost its attack up to a really high number, which is really good, but it is going to have to rely on a Gazelle to get the piercing to actually get that damage in, which again relies on your opponent having no cards in their hand, and we don't actually have any way to manipulate that. So typically the way this deck will try and win is get one good slap in on an attack mode monster, and then chip your opponent down for the remaining life points using Seven's Road Witch, because using our skill we can give Seven's Road Witch piercing, so we use that to chip over and finish our opponent off and put them on a bit of a clock. Whereas Dragius can just bully your opponent into submission immediately. So I would say the Spellcaster deck has more going on, it has more options, especially since the boss monster itself, Seventh Paladin, can just let you draw cards, which lets you dig for back row or lets you dig for additional bodies. But Dragius tends to be better at closing games, so it's a bit of a awkward decision to decide where to put these. I think realistically these two are very, very close together, so it doesn't really matter which one ends up edging out. But we will put Spellcaster ahead, just because, again, it has been performing slightly better in tournaments. And next up, we have Elemental Heroes. And Elemental Heroes is a interesting deck. This, unfortunately, is underperforming compared to all of its other Fusion brothers, but is still a strong deck. The Elemental Hero deck has still been seeing results. I mean, if we go and take a look at the data, we can see that E-Hero has not won any tournaments, but it's still seen some top 4 finishes. So still reasonably okay, right? Unfortunately, the deck can struggle to defeat high attack monsters. Now, what we have been seeing is some players leaning towards additional cards to help them deal with these monsters, such as Elemental Hero Tantalum that can deal with threats that are like level 8 and lower. We also have been seeing the Ether package and Ether Fast Strike, which can boost up to 3000 attack. But what I've seen a lot of people doing is foregoing both of those and including the Masaki package to go into their fusion, which doesn't actually help deal with any of those high attack monsters. So they trade the ability to deal with big strong monsters for the ability to bully in the early game, and I don't really think that is a good trade-off. I think realistically, if you're playing heroes, you have to include ways to deal with those bigger monsters other than just Talismanic Seal Array. But this deck does still have some really cool stuff going on, right? We're able to use Argent to get lots and lots of pluses. We can manipulate the top of our deck using things like Avian Spell Tactic to ensure that Ardent is going to plus. We have relatively easy access to getting out the Flame Wingmans, and Flame Wingman's effect itself is very, very powerful. If we're able to get it off, we can burn our opponent for an absolute ridiculous amount, and in some cases we can even kill our opponent through slime, so very, very strong. Unfortunately, with the rise of Mataran, Mataran's best ace monster is their anti-warrior card, and all of the Elemental Hero cards are warriors, which does mean that Mataran has a very, very strong matchup into Elemental Heroes, and as that deck rises, unfortunately Elemental Heroes is going to be falling. Now hopefully we will see this improve in the future, but for now Elemental Heroes, solid tier 3. So next up we have Light Galaxy. Light Galaxy I think is going to be bottom of tier 2. Light Galaxy is a bit of a weird deck. So the deck basically revolves around Secret Order. This is the Secret Order deck. And we have been seeing a couple of different builds arise from it. The one that has been performing a little bit better and has actually won a tournament is the pure version, which uses Galactica Force to AoE boost your monsters on the field, sort of like Pre-Megatana, but it boosts them based on the number of normal monsters that are face up on the field. So in order to enable that, basically the deck just plays a whole bunch of vanillas, and the strategy is that we just massively boost our attack up, use the Meteor Charge to try and get one good piercing hit in and one attack over a attack position monster, and kind of hope that's enough. Now, the other build is more of a good stuff deck. It just plays generic staples, slaps them together with this Secret Order engine basically, and tries to use that to bully your opponent. Both of these decks do have one major flaw, and that is once your Secret Orders are gone, once we've used them all, the deck kind of runs out of steam. It doesn't do much anymore from that point. You have very lackluster monsters. They're just basically vanillas, and not having effects, not having good ways to beat through your opponent's defense position monsters, not having good ways to capitalize and beat over your opponent's stronger monsters can really let the game down. So I would say this is a very aggressive aggro style deck that really wants to rush down your opponent in the first few turns of the game, and if you struggle to do so, you can struggle to close the game. So it's still doing all right, but it's cheese, right? There's a strategy there. There's lots of holes in that strategy. So when we get more cards going forward, this will get even stronger. And the fact it's already performing quite well, even with all these holes in its strategy, is kind of scary. Because how good is this deck going to get when we get more support? And next up, we have Psychics. So Psychic was the boogeyman of the last format, and it does seem to be back with a vengeance. Psychic is performing okay. We have seen quite a few people bring it to events, but we haven't seen that translate into a massive amount of top 4 representation. So this deck still does what Psychic has always done. The skill is still a really strong ability to add boss monsters to your hand. We're still able to gain a crap ton of attack. We're still able to deal with our opponent's back row between Jump Check and Melody. It still is the same combo deck it's always been. The only downside now is that a lot of the other decks have risen in power level, and that does mean they're able to keep up with Psychic a little bit more. Psychic still has some really strong matchups, and any of the decks that are a little bit slower will actually just get bullied by Psychic, because Psychic basically says, if you give me like a free turn to set up, I'm going to destroy you. So it still, again, does what it's always done. It's just the power level of everything else has kind of risen to meet it a little bit. So it's underperforming a little bit compared to last season. But again, we're still in the first week. So this could just skyrocket in popularity and in playability and in power as we go forward. So next up, we have Magnum Overlord. And this deck is barely in the meta at the moment. It's kind of fallen out of the meta for quite a long time, but it did make top 8 this week, so I thought we would mention it. It kind of does what it's always done. I will say Magnum Overlord does have one extra small benefit, which is we have had Imaginary Reactor come out, which does give Magnum Overlord a chance to get a +2, and that can be enough, especially for an OTK style deck like this. There's not, again, too much information on it. There's not much to say about it. It hasn't really got anything new other than Imaginary Reactor, so it's still there, hanging out. And then we have Vast Vulcan. Vulcan has recently received its skill buff, which does allow the pieces to get to higher attack values. Most notably, the middle piece can now reach 27, so it can attack over 25s. Now, the negative of this is we've just got a bunch of boss monsters come into the game, which are fusions, that have 2800. So now that 27 is less valuable, but Vulcan is still performing quite well. And also, we recently had the restriction on Avian Spell Tactics lifted, which is also another buff to this deck. Players did expect this deck to see a rise in popularity, and to be fair, it has been performing quite well. It's not performing as well as a lot of these other decks, but it's definitely had more impact this meta than it did have last meta. So it would be interesting to see if this sees any more experimentation going forward, or if people are going to basically forget about this deck in favor of the newer decks, but only time will tell. And then next up we have Mataran. So this is a bit of a weird one. We don't tend to do tier 1.5s here. We just tend to do, you know, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, etc, etc. But technically Mataran is almost half as many points as Cyber Dragon and double the points of what's below it, that it should kind of be in its own tier. But for now, I think we're just going to put this in the bottom of tier 1. Because again, there is going to be some variance, as well as Mataran only just got its character, so it's only just received a bunch of new skills, so this could improve in the future. So for now, we're going to put this in bottom of tier 1. But Mataran is a really scary deck. So this deck is relatively easily able to summon out these large boss monsters, made using quite a small number of resources. Most fusion monsters, we have to get out a boss monster, which usually requires 2 other monsters to get it out, and then we need the fusion spell, and then we need the other material. That's like a 5-card investment. For the Mataran, because they don't use a boss monster to make them, you just need Imaginary Reactor, Fusion, 1 other card, bam, you have your Fusion. So for 3-card investment, you get a 2800 boss with relatively strong effects. Now, all of the Mataran boss monsters, the Fusion monsters themselves, do have generally quite a good effect, and then a really, really strong effect that only gets turned on with Type Change Beam, or unless you're in a very specific matchup. But those Type Change Beam effects are really, really strong. This deck is able to pop face downs. We're able to change defense position monsters face up, or change face up monsters face down, and so attack over them or pop them. We're able to also use the Ashura Star to basically OTK our opponent, and because again these are fusion monsters that are level 9, that means that Slime won't actually protect you from the Mataran OTK. So in a way, it does play a lot like Magnum Overlord, where you just make this ridiculous attack monster, attack into your opponent, and you say, if you don't have your Legend Trap, you are dead, and you're just going to have to deal with that. So we have been seeing the rise of Mataran a little bit. It is becoming very, very strong, and if we just open the correct combination of cards on our hand, we can just end games on the spot. Now again, if this deck does run into a Legend Trap, it can stop it in its tracks, as well as that if a deck is able to be aggressive enough to apply enough pressure, and the Mataran deck doesn't find their combo early, it can just get bullied out of the game very quickly, because again, the Mataran deck is a fusion deck. We don't have a skill to search fusion, which means if we just don't draw a fusion, we can't really make any of the plays work, so that is something to take note of. This deck can just brick, but any deck can just brick. But still, one of the strongest decks in the game, and very, very scary. And this is definitely a deck to keep our eyes on going forward. Next up, we have Meeg, and Meeg is a weird one. So first off, this card was renamed to Miss Mutton, so I guess we'll be referring to it as Mutton for the rest of this. But Mutton is a weird deck. Basically, it is similar to the Galaxy deck in that it is a Secret Order deck, right? But this is Secret Order the deck, starring Miss Mutton. There are some support cards for Miss Mutton. Notably, there is Meet and Greet, which lets it attack all of your opponent's monsters, as well as giving them a attack decrease, but it does have quite a heavy investment. The skill people tend to play with this is Servant of Dawn, which does allow you to boost it quite high attack, especially if we've already used a Secret Order. It gets an attack boost, then we can use the Servant of Dawn to give it another attack boost, then we can let it attack 3 monsters, and if your opponent has all attack position monsters, there is a chance that we get to OTK our opponent. So it's reasonably strong. We haven't, though, seen this translate into tournament tops, so it's not completely dead. The deck does things, the deck can win games, the deck is kind of interesting, but it's not been seeing results, so I don't think we can put it any higher than tier 4. Realistically, it's not going to be as good as the rest of these decks, and I think based on the results we've seen so far, Galaxy does seem to be the best Secret Order deck in the format. And then we have Rebels. So Rebels has actually not seen a single top this format yet during this first week. But it's really hard to ever discount Royal Rebels. They always seem to come back. Even in the last format, where we weren't seeing Royal Rebels a ton at the start, by the end of the format, it was still the 4th best performing deck. It is a deck that has outs to seemingly everything. If you don't respect this deck and you don't play its game, you can just get completely blown out of nowhere in a similar way to Mataran, where if, again, you leave a lot of monsters face up on the field and don't really care about it, Ashura Star is going to absorb all your attack and OTK you, and in the same way, Royal Rebels is going to wipe your board with a Doom Metal play. Now, this deck still can get a bit bricky, and with the introduction of a lot more level 9 monsters in the fusions, this does mean that Heavy Metal's uses has dropped down a little bit. Now, Heavy Metal can still pop a weaker monster, gain the attack and attack over those fusions, but it can't actually pop those fusions themselves, which can get a little bit restrictive. It means the deck has technically gotten a little bit weaker, but a lot of the new decks that we have do still go wide. They still want to summon a lot of monsters on the field, which means we can punish them with Death Doom. So even though this deck hasn't seen a lot of play so far this format, I would not be surprised at all if this deck started seeing a lot of play towards the end. Next up, we have Jointech. So this one's a bit weird. So Jointech isn't really a deck. We will be talking a little bit about some of that in a bit, but for now, this is kind of machine good stuff. I think that's what we're going to call this. It's basically Hammer Crush Deal combined with Mirror Innovator. We're seeing things like just some other good stuff machines and some other good generic cards mixed in. And we're seeing this deck seeing a bit of play because we can use the Jointech Rex to pop your opponent's back row and then shuffle it back into our deck using either another copy of itself or the Mirror Innovator, and kind of just play this kind of one-dimensional gameplay loop that is actually quite effective. We haven't really seen this in tournaments yet, but we have seen this in point battles, and it has been performing reasonably well in those. It's basically Monster Mash, right? It's just a whole bunch of monsters that combine together to do some interesting things, but hopefully we'll see this in tournaments going forward so we can see how it actually matches up against the rest of the format. And next up, we have Tosseratops, and this is specifically Coin Tech. So Coin Tech is the name of a skill that basically revolves around flipping coins. This deck is not particularly great, unfortunately. Now, there might be something in the future. We have been seeing a new selection box card in Revery, which depending on the number of heads you flip when you use it, you can get multiple attacks and you can get piercing. So there is potential there, but we haven't really seen this do anything yet, so it's going to go untiered. The only reason we're even talking about it is because it is a brand new deck, so we'd mention it and say that we don't think it's very good. So coin tossing, generally not a good thing. We really kind of want to mitigate RNG if we can, and just adding extras doesn't really seem like a good thing. The skill does help mitigate this a little bit, but in my opinion, not enough. This is a fun deck, but I would not recommend taking this to an event. But again, if you just want to have a laugh, go for it. Coin Tech is there for you. And then there is Revery. So this is a deck that I haven't really had much experience with. I think I'm going to put this in bottom of tier 4. From what I've heard, people have been having some mixed success with this. But this is basically from the Galaxy Structure deck. Now, the reason this deck is so far down, even though the boss monster itself does have the ability to attack twice, which is pretty good, is it is limit 3, which means we can't play alongside Secret Order, and I think most of the time people will opt to play Secret Order over this boss monster. But from what I've heard, it's been performing okay. I personally haven't played a single game against this yet. I've not played a single game with this yet, so it's hard for me to place it much higher than here. But we haven't seen it in any tournaments either. It's got 0 results, so I think bottom of tier 4 is fair for now. And then we have our fairies. So these are Yugioh's other boss monsters. I believe this is dakeno meami or something along those. I probably butchered that name entirely, but it's something similar to that. And this is basically Mataran, but with a worse skill and being forced to run a bunch of high-level bricks. So it's no wonder we're not really seeing much experimentation with this. Now, in the coming weeks, we could see some potential out of this, right? But the boss monster itself is rather weak. It is very luck dependent because it depends on we have to mill something that has the same type as one of our opponent's cards, which is unlikely to happen. So we're not expecting this to do anything, but again, it is a brand new deck, so we thought we'd mention it. And then we have Bluetooth, or Blue Fang, as its new translation name is. And again, we don't really have the support for this card to be good, so it's not even really a deck. Unfortunately, until we get Lightwave, I don't really expect anything to come of this. We were expecting to get a skill that was similar to Lightwave, and we sort of did, but the skill is very restrictive and very bad, so it's ended up being kind of useless. Now, unfortunately, Blue Fang is just not a deck, and if it's not a deck, we can't really place it anywhere. But this is the list. I think I'm quite happy with all of these placements. Without a doubt, these are the 2 best decks in the game, the Cybur Dragon and the Mataran. And then tier 2, these are clearly the next 4 strongest decks, and performance-wise, that is being held up as well. Tier 3, these decks start to fluctuate a bit, but I do think these are all of a similar power level, and they do have similar tournament results, except obviously Royal Rumble, which doesn't have any. Tier 4, these are kind of where we get to the very experimental, maybe there's something here, maybe we'll see these get broken in the next few weeks, but I wouldn't hold your breath. And then our untiered, these are decks that have yet to do literally anything, and we don't expect them to, but you never know, maybe there's something there. But thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you next time.